3. एक सेकेंड, इसको एक को थोड़ा और छोटा कर देते हैं, इक्वल सी लग रही है फर्स्ट एंड थर्ड. ओके, so suppose I ask you, this is the standard line, which out of these 3 lines are of the equal size as the standard, which is S? C. But what he did was, एक रूम में सबको बुलाया, there are 20 people. Out of 20, 19 are confederates. What are confederates? रिसर्चर से मिले हुए हैं. उन सब ने बोला आंसर इज डी. आप क्या बोलोगे? You will feel the pressure to conform to the social norm because 19 people are saying C. You feel maybe I am wrong there, right? Let me also say C because every other person is saying C. This is a study that was done by Ash on conformity, and we found that a lot of people conformed. That is, they gave the wrong answer despite they knowing that it, or they feeling that it was wrong. Okay? So now we'll come back to the cultural context. There was a meta-analysis done of Ash type experiments. Now what is a meta-analysis? Meta-analysis is an analysis of various studies and analysis. So analysis को भी जब हम analyze करते हैं at a huge level, that becomes meta-analysis. And he found that in Eastern cultures, in collectivistic societies, conformity was much more. Why do you think conformity was much more in collectivistic cultures or Eastern cultures as compared to Western cultures?
Because we do have this conditioning of adhering
Right.
to people who are belonging to a certain.
Right. So the influence of other significant people in our lives becomes higher for people staying in collectivistic. ये अभी शुरू नहीं हुआ है, ये पहले का कर रही हूँ. हाँ हाँ मैं कर दूँगी, आप बैठ जाओ. Yes. So it's because again significant other people's opinions matter more in collectivistic culture, plus they have more, they tend to save their face more, and they feel that if I openly disagree with the majority, I might experience embarrassment and shame. They don't want to experience that embarrassment and shame by disagreeing. Therefore, they tend to conform much more than North Americans and Europeans. Another thing that we study is conformity in subsistence culture. Subsistence culture are cultures which have minimal resources. जैसे आप Eskimos रहते हैं, very basic resources. Then there are some tribes also who are against the use of technology and against the use of modernization. They live their lives with just basic resources, and studies have found that geographically and in which conditions you stay also has a huge impact on you. And they found that people who were from both, who were in Western and Eastern cultures, they experience psychological as well as physical stress much lower than people who were staying in polar regions in subsistence culture for an extended period of time. Now culture differences applies to conformity, but they do not apply to obedience. Obedience was the only thing that was found to be reliably replicated across all cultures, because there is authority everywhere, everybody feels the need to obey. Now the last thing that we are going to study in this section with respect to thought is culture and socialization. What is socialization? Socialization is a form or a process through which we tend to internalize certain beliefs, values, systems when we are a part of that system. आप इंडिया में रहते हो, आपको इंडिया सोसाइटी एक तरीके से सोशलाइज कर देती है into a way of thought. All right? So this is what socialization is. So they studied socialization with respect to child development. You remember I was talking about Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was Franz Boyle's student who worked on child development. So Margaret Mead found that people staying in Soman people, they have norms with respect to child rearing, where they focus on the fact that children should get up early, go to bed early, should keep quiet, should obey. But Manus who stay in New Guinea have a very different way of socializing their kids. In those cultures, aggressiveness in kids, violence, and being overbearing is actually encouraged and applauded. So there are cultures also who feel that aggression and violence should be encouraged in their children. These are differences in the way people are socialized or kids are socialized. Further, even within America, if we talk about Southern America and Southern region, there is a subculture of violence. Now, what does subculture of violence means? Where violence and crime are socially more accepted. And these violence that is happening in South America, much more than North America, are often directed towards either oneself, one's family, or one's possessions, not towards other people. And it is readily accepted. Another thing that we are going to study is the concept of culture of honor. So this concept says that it is a way of, endorsing male violence, men being violent whenever they feel that there is a threat to their representation or there is a threat to their economic position. रेपुटेशन या इकोनॉमिक पोजीशन को थ्रेट होगा तो कल्चर ऑफ आपका कल्चर ऑफ ऑनर विल कम इनटू बीइंग वेयर मेल वायलेंस इज socially accepted and even encouraged. And this culture of honor is prevalent in Mediterranean countries, in the Middle East as well as in Arab nations, and is clearly related to machismo in Latin America, which means again it is good to be violent if somebody is threatening your honor. This was in fact necessary in places where law and order are not in place. So when there is no law and order, when there is no cooperation, when there is no civil rights, then people have to take law and order into their own hands and fight. But as law and order gets built, as there are rules and regulations, as there are institutions, effectiveness of this culture of honor gets decreased, because then your survival is less dependent upon being aggressive, rather it is more dependent upon following the right law and order. Therefore, gradually culture of honor fades away and disappears. This was with respect to culture and what? Thought. Culture and thought and behavior. So we initially discussed all the ways in which people in different cultures differ with respect to thought, and then we also discussed in terms of behavior, which is subculture of violence, socialization, and machismo that we are talking about, culture of honor. All these are part of behavior. Thought में क्या आता है? अभी जो डिस्कस किया, एट्रीब्यूशन स्टाइल, इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोसेसिंग स्टाइल, कॉग्निटिव डिसोनेंस, स्टीरियोटाइप, रिबाउंड इफेक्ट, all these are cultural differences in thought. And what about cultural differences in language? वो भी हम कवर कर चुके हैं, नोट्स भी हैं आपके पास. तो क्वेश्चन अगर आएगा कल्चरल डिफरेंसेस में हम क्या लिखेंगे? लैंग्वेज, थॉट, बिहेवियर. ठीक है. नाउ वील मूव टू अनदर सेक्शन. हाँ जी, नॉन वर्बल कम्युनिकेशन कैसे डिफरेंट होती है डिफरेंट कल्चर्स में. वी टॉक्ड अबाउट फेशियल डिस्प्ले रूल्स, वी टॉक्ड अबाउट डिफरेंसेस इन जेस्चर एंड पोस्चर्स, वी टॉक्ड अबाउट डिफरेंसेस इन डिफरेंट नॉन वर्बल क्यूज. वर्बली ऑल्सो हमने लैंग्वेज का डिस्कस किया हुआ है. तो ऑल दीज थिंग्स यू हैव टू राइट. नाउ वील स्टार्ट विद कॉन्टैक्ट बिटवीन कल्चर्स. प्लीज क्लैप फॉर नीर फॉर मेकिंग द प्रेजेंटेशन. Okay. So what do you think happens when people belonging to different culture come into contact with each other?
Cultural exchange.
Cultural exchange would happen. Okay. What do you mean by cultural exchange here?
For example, there are certain behaviors that are very particular to a certain
Which are culture specific, yes.
Like for example, when we talk about the culture of gathering on Christmases and celebrating Thanksgiving for that matter, which is a very Western thing, but it has started to come to India as well. People have to start celebrating these things which are more influenced in the Western.
So your assumption is that if people come into contact with other people from other cultures, they will be able to understand their culture better and cross-cultural integration can happen, right? There will be more harmony. There will be more harmony, more stability, but most of the time intercultural contact is not long enough to cause permanent change in attitudes or behavior. Intercultural contact is relatively short, less intimate and very variable. तो आपका कम कांटेक्ट होगा जो मोस्ट ऑफ द केसेस में क्रॉस कल्चरल कांटेक्ट में रहता है. It will not cause change in attitudes or behavior. Rather, what happens is most of the time brief interactions with people from different culture actually results in increasing prejudice and stereotypes. Because now with just brief interaction you will get some evidence to justify your prejudice or stereotype. You know, Westerners are very cold. You go to US for a week, nobody speaks to you, nobody greeted me warmly. Westerners are very cold. Brief intercultural contact leads to heightened prejudice and stereotype. This goes against the contact hypothesis, which says that bringing people of different culture together actually leads to improved relationship. So this is what contact hypothesis says. It is hypothesized that more contact should lead to decreased prejudices. However, this is not often the case. A lot of times just little contact leads to increased prejudices. Can I move to the next slide?
Ma'am, but isn't it also because people have certain stereotypes and prejudice towards other people's culture? Like,
Yes.
Become more accepting.
Yes. If you meet somebody from another culture with an open mind, with a blank slate, then you will just accept and acknowledge what you are receiving rather than justify or validate your preconceived notions. Right? But a lot of time we have prejudices, we have stereotypes, and we tend to validate them through our little experiences that we get. Confirmation bias. Right? Okay, coming to language and communication. So first point is that for most multicultural societies, like let us take the example of either India or let us take the example of America. For most multicultural society, whether multicultural society का मतलब पता है ना, whether people from different cultures staying together, there will always be a high status dominant group, right? And their high status dominant group will have an associated dominant language, which is English for Americans, Hindi for Indians, despite it being a multicultural country, and other people who are not aware of this dominant language will face obstacles in having smooth communication or in fact other kinds of encounters with people. For example, even if we take the example of language in France, which is of course the dominant language French, if you are somebody who does not know French in France, you will not be able to do anything, not just you won't be able to communicate with other people, but you will feel that in a way you are ostracized, you are not included as being a part of them. You will find difficulties even in doing normal routine things or doing a normal job if you happen to work there. In fact, even the speech style that you have or the accent that you have also has an impact on how you are perceived. There have been studies that have been done in Australia by these people. Let me erase these lines for better clarity. So, Australian study done by Gallios and Callan they found that people who are natives of Australia who speak English in an Australian accent, they were much less attentive to listening to somebody talk in English with an Italian accent. Now you also imagine yourself that you're listening to a TED talk. The speaker is either American or Indian. Who do you think you will be more attentive to? Somebody speaking an Indian accent of English or American accent? Maybe both, because we're used to listening to both. But imagine somebody talking in English with a French accent. Have you heard Esther Perel?
Yes, ma'am.
She has a typical French accent. Do you feel that she is able to engage you and get the same amount of attentiveness as other people? मेहनत ज़्यादा लगती है. This is across every place where differences in speech and accent reduces the attentiveness. There was also another very interesting study done by these people along with some other, Gallios, Barker, Jones and Callan. So what they studied was communication styles of people and how differences in communication styles are perceived by different people coming from different cultures. So what they did was they made 24 videotaped clippings. Each clipping had a student-teacher pair. The scenario was such that the student is asking the teacher either to help them with an assignment or to complain about their grade. So this is the scenario. The teacher is always an Australian. On the other hand, students can either be an Australian or a Chinese student. Now Australia has a lot of Chinese students. Almost 90% students in Australia in higher studies are Chinese because Australians don't want to study that much. So a student could either be Australian or Chinese. Teacher was always Australian. The student could be either male or female. 3 types of communication styles were adopted by the students. So either they would complain about their grades or ask for help in an aggressive manner. That is first style. Second style was assertive. And the third was submissive. Okay. These 3 styles, communication styles were used. Then both Australian and Chinese students were showed these 24 videotapes and they were asked to rate each of these communication styles with respect to the degree of effectiveness. What do you think would be the results? What style would be perceived as being effective and by whom? Okay. So the results indicated that for both Australian and Chinese students, aggressive style was ineffective and inappropriate. Alright. Australians felt that assertive style was an effective style. Most of the Australians typically assume a assertive style in terms of communication. That is typical or stereotypical of Australians. They judged submissive style to be ineffective. Now submissive style is a typical of Chinese students, right? So they felt that your submissive style was inefficient and it showed that you do not need assistance, right? You are not serious enough about asking for help. On the other hand, when Chinese students were asked about their view after watching those 24 videotapes, they said that submissive style was more effective than the assertive style. So definitely there are cultural differences in the way we perceive different forms of communication as well. We tend to feel that the way we talk is the more preferred or effective style. Okay? The second point is that the magnitude of the magnitude of perceived cultural differences can influence intercultural contact, which means when we perceive other people to be dissimilar from us, we are less likely to have a contact with them. The more similar somebody is to us, the more we are likely to have a contact. What do you think is the reason behind it? Of course, general dislike or hostility or stereotypes and prejudices is one reason. But apart from that, do you think there's any other reason for it as well? Studies found that people actually experience anxiety while having intercultural contacts, because now you're not aware of their social cues, you're not aware of their cultural cues. Today, if I ask you, there's a Japanese delegate, can you just show that person the entire campus? Versus there's a new Indian student who has joined this course, can you just show him or her around? What do you think you will be more comfortable with? एक्साइटमेंट जापानीज के साथ इंटरेक्ट करने में ज़्यादा होगी. Yeah, from that perspective, yes. So when we are interacting with somebody who is culturally dissimilar to us, we are likely to experience some form of anxiety. Greater the dissimilarity, greater the perceived difference, higher the likelihood of we trying to distance ourselves with them. Alright, so perceived cultural differences also often lead to decreased intercultural contact. Now coming to the settings, there are certain settings that make contact between group easier, versus there are some factors that make contact between groups more difficult. तुमने प्रेजेंटेशन बनाने के बाद तुम क्लास में ध्यान ही नहीं दे रहे हो, क्या कर रहे हो? या आपके साथ कौन बैठा है? हाँ, व्हाट्स योर नेम? दिया, आगे आके बैठ जाओ. कम कम कम. आई एम सॉरी, आई डोंट हैव एनी वॉलंटियर्स हु विल बी रेडी टू सिट देयर. सबको आगे बैठना पसंद है जो आगे बैठे. But you can like maybe sit somewhere else. You can share the desk with the two girls who are sitting there. Yeah. Okay. So the settings make a huge difference. If the setting is such that there is contact between two cultures happening and the culture is similar with respect to cooperation, if the two cultures have shared goals on which they are working, and if they are comparatively equal on power, then the communication that will happen between them will lead to a more positive experience and will happen comfortably. Rather, you think of a situation where instead of cooperation they are competing. With respect to shared goals, they don't have much, and with respect to equal status, again one is a developed nation and the other is a developing nation. What kind of contact would they have? Not a very positive one, rather a negative one. Imagine the contact between America and China. Right? There are also other features that can act as a barrier for effective communication. For example, African Americans have a very particular style of speaking. The way they use intonations and the way they express intensity in their speech are very different. So that particular style of speaking is something that we will refer to as intentional social linguistic marker. Of course, they can also speak like other masses. यहाँ पे नहीं है, हाँ. Intentional social linguistic marker. So it's not that they can't speak English like the majority people there. It's just that they prefer talking in this accent and speech style because it helps them create their own unique identity and makes them more separate and distinguished and distinct from the majority group. It's a way through which they mark their difference from a dominant majority. Further, international contact can add further barriers. Now imagine, like right now we are just talking about Americans, African Americans talking to white Americans and using intentional social linguistic markers. Now if this communication happens between people who come from different countries altogether, now there are more features that can add to the complexity, such as the norms, the social norms of that country, the political institutions of the country, the basic value system. So further barriers will keep getting added as the cultural differences increase. There's a very interesting study about international contact that we'll discuss later, although I'm tempted to share it right now, but I'll park it for later. So even when it comes to intercultural, inter-country contact, whenever the contact is shorter, less frequent and less intimate, the differences would be more. So basically the features or factors that increase barrier between contact between two nations are these: whether the interaction is short term or long term, whether the interaction is more or less frequent, what is the variability of intimacy, what is the relative status of each group. We have discussed the relative status and power already. So these factors will also determine and add barriers to communication whenever there is a inter-country communication happening. Of course, we have already discussed there are certain cultural markers also that differentiates people's behavior across different countries. For example, with respect to communication, we have different non-verbal cues, different facial display rules, different gestures. We discussed how Japanese point to self by pointing out their nose, and an American touch their chest when they're talking about themselves. Other differences in postures and gestures we've also discussed. Facial display rules. Remember when we were talking about how they were more open to expressing their opinions in private than in public. Japanese people did not express their true feelings in public, rather they were okay expressing it in public. So there are cultural differences in the way we communicate verbally, non-verbally. We have differences in difference in facial display roles, posture, kinesthetic, the way we touch. There are variations in interpersonal distance also. Like for example, here in India, I am just standing say 2 meters away from you, which falls under which interpersonal zone? Social. In Western countries, public distance that should be there between the person addressing a crowd and the crowd should be at least 4 meters, minimum 4 to 5 meters, but I am just standing just 2 meters away and I am comfortable with it. You are also comfortable with it. But if you look at Western societies and how the classrooms are built, you will notice there is a huge stage and there is at least 4 to 5 meter distance between the students and the person addressing it. Differences in interpersonal distance. So in like this also we have discussed that intergroup and intercultural contact can be severely curtailed if it leads to anxiety and uncertainty. If you feel anxious interacting with somebody, you will not want to interact with them. The fact that most of the time intercultural contact is marked by some amount of anxiety again means that the amount of contact that they'll have with other people will be much lower, right? Okay, moving to the next section, which is language and communication. So here language itself poses a problem because again we know that for a lot of things we might not have the right word to translate it into a different language. We had discussed that the word veranda is specific to Indians. How do we translate it into Hindi? How do we translate veranda into English? We don't have any word. Balcony also doesn't justify it. Similarly, you have a perspective in psychology called Gestalt psychology. Gestalt is a very specific word coming from German language. There is no English translation to it. We try to explain Gestalt by calling it a configuration or by saying putting together things or saying that we should look at the wholes. But that also does not capture the essence of the term gestured, because a lot of times words are very specific to a certain culture and language, and its meaning is not directly translatable. Secondly, even if the meaning is translatable, the way the word uses, the way in which we use the word and how its usage is culturally intertwined is also different. For example, in English language, we always use the term I, or we use the word I when we are talking about something, right? But in Japanese, there are a lot of times that they drop the word I itself, because they don't want to make, they don't want that the phrase should have some center with respect to themselves, because Japanese is a collectivistic society in which they have more interdependent self-construals. That is, the way they define themselves is not just in what? अच्छा, try कर लेते हैं. Okay. So in Japanese culture, it is more interdependent. That means that the way they look at themselves is not just through viewing themselves, rather they view themselves as a part of a larger society. They have an interdependent view of their own self versus the way Westerners view themselves, which is as a particular individual independent. Therefore, in American language, I is always present. Rather, in Japanese language, they often drop the word I when referring or when just speaking. In Hindi also we tend to use I, hum, aap, but we are also specifically putting ourselves out there. But in Japanese, the way they talk, they will not be referring to themselves at all.
तो इंडिया में तो कलेक्टिविस्टिक कल्चर है ना इंडिया कलेक्टिविस्टिक कल्चर है ना
Yes.
तो हम भी तो हम करके बात करते हैं कि मतलब
आप हम करके करते हैं, कई मैं करके भी बात करता है,
करके
कई.
भी करते हैं लेकिन
हाँ.
हम कोई कॉन्सेप्ट समझा रहे हैं
हाँ, at least see, here we talk, at least we talk about, even if you're talking about yourself, you would just say हमको ये ठीक नहीं लग रहा है. But in English we will never say we don't feel, till the time other people are also involved. It will always be I, right? Okay. Further complexities get further complexity. So okay, so this study about I being separate was done by Yoshi Kashima and Emiko Kashima. So they found that in Japanese language we often drop I because we don't want to view ourselves as being separate from the others. So interestingly, this is the side I am going to talk about, which I told you. When the contact between, of course there is definitely cultural differences in language. This differences in language can create massive problems in cases there is political contact happening, and when there are politics of two different nations involved, it can lead to significant issues. For example, there was a time when there was an American surveillance aircraft, it got damaged because it got like hit by a Chinese aircraft accidentally, and they had to make an emergency landing on the shores of China. And in the process what happened was the main Chinese pilot, he went missing. So because of the accident, and again this the aircraft we are talking about is a surveillance aircraft, right? It's not a normal usual aircraft. So again it had to make an emergency landing, because of which a Chinese pilot went missing. China wanted America to assume responsibility for it, take the ownership and take the blame. Rather, when the American president addressed Chinese audience or his audience, he said, "We regret that the Chinese pilot went missing." So the term regret did not really capture the essence of taking accountability or ownership of an accident that happened, which led to differences again. Again, America and China already have differences. It just escalated it. So there was another round of apologies that had to be made by the American president. Here the American president said that I deeply regret and I am very sorry that the Chinese pilot went missing. Again, the Chinese audience did not take it ill because what they were wanting was accountability and ownership. By just saying that they're very sorry or that they deeply regret, that message was still not, their expectation was still not fulfilled. So the expression was totally ambiguous with respect to accepting the blame. Alright? Now we'll discuss the last section with respect to contact between culture, which is acculturation and culture change. So acculturation is actually a process through which we internalize the rules, beliefs and behaviors of some other culture. Right? This is the process of acculturation. So what happens when immigrants go to another country? What happens when immigrants go to another country? They are forced ओके क्लाइमेट वाइज बात नहीं कर रहे हम कल्चरली बात कर रहे हैं व्हेन एन इमिग्रेंट मूव्स टू अनदर कंट्री he is forced with two choices, that is either to maintain his own culture, the culture where the immigrant comes from, or to maintain or to adopt or internalize the culture of the place that he has moved to, either to retain the home country culture or to adopt the host country culture, right? The best strategy for an immigrant is to integrate, which is retain your own cultural practices at the same time adopting and internalizing other cultures' practices. So is acculturation that happens, is acculturation only relevant to immigrants? Give me an example.
Ma'am, for example, however, even like for example, if we talk about India for that matter, multicultural country, right? So there are people belonging to different cultures living in different places. For example, if I happen to migrate from say Delhi to Mumbai.
What happens when there are so many Indians who migrate to Canada? How would Canadians feel? That's what I'm saying. वहाँ पे ऐसा हो गया है ना. How would Canadians feel? They would also feel threatened that their culture or their dominant culture will lose its value. That now, I'm sorry. Speak. Yes, so even if that happens, if in a region where there are predominantly one language that people are speaking, if North Indians go to Bangalore and they feel okay, हमारा यहाँ पे culture spoil हो गया है, because they also fear that their culture is now at threat. People from outside will come and try to enforce their culture on them since they are now becoming the majority there. There are so many people who are migrating. So they also experience acculturation stress. So it does not only apply to immigrants but also applies to host groups, especially when indigenous populations are overwhelmed by mass migration. Acculturation is the process through which we internalize values, beliefs, practices of a particular culture. That is acculturation. अब acculturation में भी बहुत सारी practices होती है, 4 तरीके होते हैं जिससे हम acculturate कर सकते हैं, which I will now come to. Okay. So generally what happens is that if there is somebody who is acculturating, which means they go to another cultures, imagine Indians migrating to either Canada or America, what will happen to that person? The person will now identify as an Indian as well as an American or a Canadian. They'll have dual identities.
Indian है जैसे African through American
Yes, so they'll have dual identities. This is very similar to having bicultural identity. Now the good thing about dual identity or having a bicultural identity is that their sense of self is not determined by a single culture, other multiple cultures. And they can easily switch off and on different aspects of their identity. So if suppose they are dealing with Indians, and they have an Indian cultural identity, they can easily switch it on and put off the other cultural identity. They are able to switch it on and off depending upon the situation, the people that they are talking to, as well as the kind of identity that they are required to bring to forth. So that is the beauty of having a bicultural identity. And they often have self-concepts that are blended together. Like their sense of self, what is self-concept? Your sense of self. So their sense of self is now derived from both cultural values and beliefs. So it is not based upon particularly what one culture says are the do's and don'ts. It gets blended together.
जब दो कंट्री के होते हैं तो फिर आप कौन से कंट्री के होते हैं मतलब वो देशभक्त और देश प्रेमी का वो आ जाता है ना
आप दोनों कंट्रीज के हो गए. India is also good, America is also good. India has my roots, America gave me livelihood. I go back to India, I become Indian. I go to America, I work, I enjoy the quality of life and I hang out with other people.
मतलब अगर आप जाना चाहते हैं कि अरे नहीं मुझे फॉरेन जाके सेटल होना है तो फिर उस चीज़ को शेम किया जाता है कि देश प्रेमी नहीं ऐसा होता है
नहीं, आप शेम करते हो.
होता है ना कि
दुनिया तो बोलती है वाह अमेरिका चले गया, कितनी अच्छी किस्मत है. शेम कौन करता है आजकल? करते हैं.
इंडिया में नहीं रहोगे तुम बाहर जाना तुम्हें पसंद है आप बाहर से करते हैं ना
मैंने ना शेम करते नहीं देखा, मैंने तो अपलोड करते देखा ज़्यादा. एनीवे अटेंडेंस शीट नहीं आई, ले आओ प्लीज. ओके, कैन यू प्लीज डिस्कस द लास्ट सेक्शन, then I leave you all. So Berry, दो तो लग ही जाएंगे. So Berry said that acculturation can happen in 4 ways. So the name of the psychologist who gave this theory is Berry, Berry. So he said that there are 4 paths to actually acculturating. One could be integration, which means you adopt, you retain your own culture where you come from, and when you move out, you are adopting the culture of the host country also. Another strategy could be assimilation. Assimilation means that now you will give up on your own home culture and totally internalize the host country's culture. So now if you are an Indian moving to say America, you will forget all your Indian cultural practices etc. and you will just try to behave and internalize the culture of America. So you forget, you try to assimilate the knowledge to all the cultural practice, you internalize the new cultural norm and forget the previous one. Then we have separation. Separation would mean that you maintain your own home culture, you are not adopting host country culture, therefore you are at a risk of either isolation or alienation. बिकॉज अब मैं इंडियन हूँ, मैं इंडियन से ही इंटरेक्ट करूँगा, मैं वही चीज़ें बिहेव करूँगा जैसे करता था. आई बिकॉज ऑफ विच you will be unable to fit in with the host country culture and it will lead to isolation and alienation. Then comes marginalization. Marginalization means I have moved out of my home country, I am going to give up on my home country culture. But at the same time, host country culture is so new that I am unable to adopt the host country culture also. So neither am I able to retain my home country culture, neither am I able to adopt the new host country culture. So these are 4 strategies through which you can acculturate. Which strategy do you think is the most effective one? Of course, integration. Why? So yes, And why should we not lose our culture?
फिर वो एक्सटेंशन हो जाएगा ना कल्चर का, तो ऐसे से करते
मैं तो जो ये बोल रही थी वो बोल लेंगे, देश छोड़ के चला गया, इंडिया को भी छोड़ दिया. We have to, we are humans, humans are social beings. They have to maintain social harmony. They'll be able to maintain social harmony only when they retain both the cultures. Yes, and moreover, a lot of times if you end up giving up your culture in a host country, they might also not respect the fact that you gave up your culture altogether. Having your own unique identity as well as adopting their practices makes you appear as somebody who is more integrative, more accommodating, more. So it adds some positive quality onto you, which makes you more, which focuses more on harmony. It helps you gain social support. We all need social support, so now you can, go back to your folks back in India for support. You can take support from the majority of people who are staying in your host country. So from harmony, stability and relationship point of view, this is the best strategy that one can adopt. Moreover, successful integration definitely takes a lot of time and lot of effort, and it usually completes when host culture's expectation of assimilation are complete. So whenever the host culture feels now they have totally adopted our practices, it is when the integration will finally become complete. Because you don't have to adopt your home culture practice, that is already there. जब आप host culture के पूरी तरीके से adopt कर लोगे, तब integrate कर पाओगे, and this is the reason why integration often takes a lot of time. And moreover, it is not the first generation of immigrants who actually face trouble. It is the second generation of immigrants who often face more difficulties. Why? उन्होंने तो होम कंट्री का कल्चर देखा नहीं है. The second generation immigrants.
सेकंड जनरेशन के लिए वो जो होस्ट कंट्री है वो उनकी होम कंट्री.
Exactly. For second generation, they have seen home culture only through their elders and parents and family. They have not seen home culture by staying in that country. For them, the host country culture itself becomes the home country culture. That is the reason why there are a lot of conflicts between first generation immigrants and second generation immigrants. Because first generation can't understand second generation can't understand the first generation. And in fact, this conflict I'm talking about, if integration happens, if you are able to assimilate all the cultural practices of the West, for example, then the conflict that you will have with the conflict between first and second generation will also be reduced, because as a part of assimilating the culture, you will acknowledge the fact that the second generation is more into the host culture. So that awareness will and that acceptance will lead to less conflicts and cultural clashes. But if assimilation does not happen, if integration does not happen, if you are focused on maintaining separate culture, then it will lead to a lot of conflicts. Okay? नहीं हो पाएगी. Okay. So with this we have covered the unit on communication and culture. Your unit 1 is over. The next unit that we will start is interpersonal relations. Tomorrow we will start interpersonal relations, and Prachi has volunteered to make a presentation for that. Please clap for her. कोई बात नहीं, ऐसे बनाओगे ये भी चल लेगी, इससे भी तो हो गया.